Steinar is going to be talking about his project on the inland sea.
I'm Steinar, and my project is called the Inland Sea, an Australian Odyssey. It is an online documentary or an experiment in convergence journalism and repurposing of documentary content. Last year's presentation was mainly about the theoretical framework of the project, but to kind of just connect what I talked about last year to what I'm going to talk about this year, which is more about form and content. In 2003, research at the BBC in the UK revealed an unrest that new media technologies have created in the newsroom. Journalists reported lack of time to adequately use and master the technology, feeling stressed because of the immediate nature of the internet. Digitalisation and the internet command an increased work pace for multitasking journalists, and according to Phillips and Lindgren, online reporters need to be able to switch effortlessly between media, and in the digital world, it is only content that matter, not the distribution platform. But in order to be able to publish our beautiful content, we do need skills in using a bundle of new tools. And we also need an understanding about available technology and the available distribution platforms. So, in my case, I come from a newspaper background. I'm a writing journalist, and in terms of the bundle of new tools, I felt about as useful as a typewriter. So, this is where this project came into be a bit. Because of that background, I wanted to learn more about audiovisual storytelling. I wanted to work with new media or convergence journalism, and also learn the ropes a bit about online publishing. Arguably far away from the digital realm, I want to talk a bit about the backstory for the project. So we're going to go back to Norway in 2007, and I want to introduce you to Asgeir and his home, which is a 3.5 square metre tree hut called The Ship. I heard about this and I ran a story about it in the local newspaper back in 2007. I was back working there for 6 months. Asgeir was part of a small eco-village outside of Oslo that was called Tre Hyttelandsbyen. There were 7 residents and they were all living in tree huts. In 2007, after 8 years, the local council threw them out for breach of local building laws. And they also were asked to tear down all the tree huts. Other things that were mentioned was the fact that they weren't connected to main electricity, they weren't connected to the main sewage system and all those. But there were reasons for that, because they wanted to live more on nature's terms. They had an outdoor toilet which they used to compost soil, which they again used to grow their own food. And they had an art workshop there that they built that was on the ground, it was not on the treetops. A recording studio, and they hosted an annual music festival out there. So around this time they appeared in a lot of Norwegian media, and the battle continued. They got help pro bono from eco-architects who helped them shape the village, helped them rewrite a proposal to be accepted as an experimental community in the local council. And as of July this year, they were successful. So they're now moving back into the tree huts. The impetus for this documentary was to look for types of alternative communities in and around Australia. What sort of similarities would I find? What kind of, what would be very different? And I didn't even know if there existed communities like this in Australia. In 10 weeks, we drove 16,000 kilometres, which interestingly enough is roughly the same distance as from Melbourne to Oslo. You do have a very big country down here, you know. So some of the themes was, like I've talked about, exploring the notion of community in the outback. I'll get back to that a bit later on. But also there's a travel narrative there, and using travel as research. And also, because this is so new to me as well, it's an experiment. I want to document the process of making a documentary to an extent. So, some of the communities that we did visit, I think we ended up visiting 7 different eco-villages and then a few other types of communities as well. But the first one we went to, which is in Aldinga, which is fairly close to Adelaide, we found a very well-established community on that was the first hit. They had about 100 residents, and the whole operation was pretty much run like a real estate business. But they had certain clauses in their building laws that said that, for example, all the houses had to be built from second-hand material. All houses had to face towards north so that you get passive heating from the sun. You had to grow stuff, either vegetables or native plants, and there were all these things in their rules and regulations that you had to abide by to move in there. This community, they've been working for 30 years to get this set up, and now they've actually got council approval for their own sewage system. Even everyone's on solar, but they're also connected to the main power grid. But in this community, every single house feeds power into the grid rather than taking it out of it. So I think that's kind of interesting. So they're actually making money on electricity in this community. Because Australia is such a big country and they're so far in between these communities, or at least along our travel route, we had to kind of expand the idea of community a little bit. You know, in the middle of nowhere, how do you do a story about community? So we had heard about this lady from a Swiss backpacker, and her name is Molly Clark. She's mid-80s, and up until 2007, she was living all by herself in the Simpson Desert. We sat down, had an interview with Molly, and talked about, you know, the idea of community when you're so isolated from the rest of society. To Ben Clark in Geraldton, who's just embarked on a thing called the 100-mile diet, which means that he's only eating and drinking things that are produced within the 100-mile radius of the house he lives in. So this is a way for him to connect to the local area, to connect to the local people through food and drink, essentially. We also did a story in Margaret River about the soup kitchen, which is a 14-year tradition, runs twice every week. And driving from Margaret River, we stumbled onto a big camp of logging protesters. And then there's Prince Leonard and the Hutt River province. Without much ado, I just want to show you a little video. Very excited about this. I hope you've brought your passports, for we are about to leave Australia. The year is 1970. The Hutt River province officially secedes from Australia after a major fallout with the government over a federally imposed quota on wheat production. Farmer Leonard George Castley becomes Prince Leonard I.
This is where you get a visa in your passports when I go behind the counter. Yeah. And I'll check it with the ultraviolet light, make sure it's good. Yeah. And the colouring comes up in the middle. And this is your one for Australia. Yeah. I'll check it, see if it's any good. It's okay.
I saw you laughing at the royal picture there. Prince Leonard does pledge allegiance to the British Queen, but he doesn't pledge any allegiance to Australia. He actually declared war on Australia in 1970. It lasted for 3 days, and there were fighter jets flying pretty low over his farm. But there was never any hot confrontation there with any arms fired. Okay, obviously I couldn't do all of this all by myself, so I travelled with 3 others, which is my good friend Eric from Norway, who's currently doing a master's thesis with the University of Oslo, where part of his project is to translate Joseph Furphy's great Australian novel into Norwegian. My partner Dita, who's a visual artist, and Ben from Melbourne, who's a prospective filmmaker. So because there were 3 of us who were Norwegian, naturally we would talk Norwegian now and then, and we'd also talk Norwegian on camera. I didn't really think much about it. I always thought it was going to be presented in English, but having thought a bit about it, I went back to Norway a couple of months ago and worked for a newspaper, and I found myself using a dictionary to translate words and expressions from English and back to my native language because I didn't know the Norwegian term for things anymore, which is a really interesting It's really awkward, and it's also quite interesting what happens to you when you've lived overseas for seven years. It's a long time. So therefore I do want to kind of play up that part a bit. So the idea is to present certain pieces to camera in English and do all the voiceovers in Norwegian with subtitles. So project status, this is where I'm at and what I'm doing. Roughly 24 webisodes of roughly 5 minutes each. They'll start in a couple of weeks on the website. So there'll be about one or two videos a week until the end of March. And that's me. Thank you.